In this episode, we're going to bring a lot of threads together and focus on the practical question that makes privacy programs either strong or fragile. How do you enforce safeguards so they keep working after the policy is published and the project team moves on? Safeguards are the protections you put in place to reduce privacy risk, like access limits, retention rules, vendor controls, and incident response practices. The challenge is that safeguards exist in a living organization where priorities shift, people change roles, systems evolve, and vendors update their services. If safeguards are only described in a policy document, they will drift. If safeguards are only implemented as technical settings, they can be misconfigured or bypassed when a team is in a hurry. Real enforcement comes from a system of reinforcement. Policies that define expectations, procedures that turn expectations into repeatable actions, contracts that bind external parties, and accountability checks that verify safeguards remain in place. Our goal today is to understand how these enforcement tools fit together, why each one matters, how they work at a high level, and what failure modes to watch for so the program stays durable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPM in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Policies are the starting point because they establish the organization's rules and boundaries in a way that can be communicated and defended. A policy is not simply a set of suggestions. It is a statement of what the organization expects people to do and what the organization commits to doing. For privacy, policy often defines concepts like permitted data use, data classification, access expectations, retention, vendor management, and rights support. The strength of policy is that it creates a shared baseline and makes accountability possible, because you cannot hold people to a standard that has never been stated. The limitation of policy is that it does not execute itself. People do not wake up and follow policies because the words exist, especially when they are busy and deadlines are looming. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking that writing a policy is the hard part, when in reality the hard part is making it usable. A policy that is too abstract, too long, or too disconnected from workflows becomes background noise. Enforcement begins when policies are written in a way that can be translated into procedures and when policy owners are clearly identified, because ownership is what keeps policies from becoming stale. Procedures are where policies become real actions, because procedures define the repeatable steps people follow to implement safeguards consistently. For example, a policy might say access should be limited to those who need it, while a procedure defines how access requests are submitted, who approves them, how access is provisioned, and how access is reviewed periodically. A policy might say data should be retained only as long as necessary, while a procedure defines retention schedules, deletion triggers, legal hold processes, and verification reporting. A policy might say privacy reviews are required for new processing, while a procedure defines the review trigger, what information must be provided, who reviews it, and what outcomes are possible. The strength of procedures is that they reduce decision-making burden in the moment, because people can follow a known path rather than inventing one. The limitation is that procedures can become too heavy or too slow, and when that happens, people bypass them, creating untracked work that is riskier. Effective enforcement therefore requires procedures to be practical, aligned with existing workflows, and designed so the secure path is the easiest path, not the most frustrating one. Contracts play a crucial enforcement role because many privacy risks involve third parties, and third parties cannot be governed by your internal policies alone. A contract is how you extend your privacy expectations beyond your organization's boundaries and create enforceable obligations for vendors, partners, and service providers. Strong privacy contracts define purpose limitation, restrictions on secondary use, confidentiality obligations, access controls, subprocessor controls, incident notification timelines, audit or assurance rights, data return or deletion requirements, and transfer constraints when relevant. The strength of contracts is that they create legal leverage and clarity, which helps prevent misunderstandings and provides a path for remedies if obligations are breached. The limitation is that contracts are only effective if they match operational reality and if the organization monitors whether the vendor is actually complying. A beginner might assume that once the contract is signed, the risk is solved, but contracts are more like guardrails than shields. They define the road boundaries, but you still need to watch whether the vehicle stays on the road. Enforcement, therefore, includes contract management practices, such as tracking subprocessor changes, reviewing updates to service terms, and ensuring vendors provide evidence of controls over time. Accountability checks are what turn policies, procedures, and contracts into a living enforcement system, because accountability checks verify that safeguards exist and are functioning. Accountability checks can include access reviews, audit logs review, retention deletion reports, vendor assurance review, training completion tracking, and targeted assessments of high-risk workflows. Their strength is that they detect drift early and create evidence that the organization can use to demonstrate compliance and good faith governance. Their limitation is that checks can become superficial if they are treated as a ritual or if no one acts on the findings. A check that generates a report no one reads is not enforcement. It is documentation theater. So effective accountability checks require clear ownership, defined follow-up actions, and a culture where findings lead to improvement rather than blame. Privacy management should aim to design checks that are proportionate, meaning they focus attention where the risk is highest and where the harm would be greatest. Too many checks create noise and fatigue, while too few checks allow drift to go unnoticed. The purpose of checks is to keep safeguards aligned with reality as the organization changes. Enforcement works best when you treat these elements as a chain, because each element supports the others. Policies define what must be true, procedures define how to make it true, contracts extend truth obligations to external parties, and accountability checks confirm truth remains true over time. If you remove one link, the system weakens. Without policy, procedures lack authority and consistency. Without procedures, policy stays abstract and teams invent inconsistent practices. Without contracts, vendors may process data in ways that conflict with your commitments. Without accountability checks, drift becomes invisible until it becomes a crisis. A beginner-friendly way to see this is to imagine a safeguard like retention control. The policy states retention limits exist. The procedure defines deletion operations and legal hold exceptions. Vendor contracts require deletion and limit retention in external systems, and accountability checks confirm deletion jobs ran and vendors provided evidence. Without one of these, you can end up with data lingering in backups, exports, or vendor platforms, and you will not know until it is too late. Enforcement is the design of this chain. It's also important to understand common failure modes in enforcement, because they are predictable and preventable. One failure mode is mismatch, where policy says one thing but procedures and systems do another, such as promising deletion while backups are retained indefinitely. Another failure mode is orphaning, where safeguards have no owner, so when teams reorganize or people leave, controls decay. Another failure mode is exception creep, where exceptions become the norm, like granting broad access for convenience and never revisiting it. Another failure mode is uncontrolled change, where new features, new integrations, or new vendors alter data flows without triggering privacy review. Another failure mode is over-reliance on trust, where leaders assume trained employees or reputable vendors will behave correctly without verification. These failure modes matter because they are not about bad people. They are about normal organizations under pressure. Privacy management's job is to design enforcement that anticipates pressure and still holds. When you can name failure modes, you can design accountability checks that detect them and procedures that prevent them. Enforcement also depends on designing procedures and checks that respect how teams actually work, because enforcement that feels impossible will be bypassed. A practical privacy program does not try to force every decision through a single bottleneck. Instead, it defines clear triggers for review and equips teams with reusable standards so most work can proceed without delay. For example, a standard vendor intake process with clear data sharing rules can allow low-risk vendors to be approved quickly while focusing deeper review on high-risk vendors. Standard data classification labels can allow teams to apply appropriate handling rules without needing a new meeting for every file. Standard access roles can speed onboarding while still enforcing least privilege. Accountability checks can be automated where possible, like periodic access review reports, rather than relying on manual audits that occur only once a year. The idea is to make enforcement compatible with delivery, because privacy and productivity are not opposing goals when enforcement is designed intelligently. Intelligent enforcement reduces surprise rework, and reduced rework is what keeps organizations moving. Another key part of enforcement is making accountability personal and clear without making it punitive. Accountability in privacy management means roles are defined, responsibilities are assigned, and decisions are documented. It does not mean looking for someone to blame when something goes wrong. In fact, punitive cultures often reduce safety because people hide mistakes instead of reporting them early. A healthier approach is to treat accountability as clarity: who owns a data set, who approves access, who manages retention, who coordinates rights requests, and who manages vendor obligations. When ownership is clear, safeguards are maintained. When ownership is vague, safeguards decay because everyone assumes someone else is handling it. Accountability checks become more effective when owners are known, because findings can be routed to the right person quickly. This is also where leadership matters, because leaders set incentives and make it safe to prioritize privacy tasks that may not be glamorous but are essential for trust. Privacy enforcement succeeds when accountability is built into job responsibilities and supported by leadership rather than being an optional side task. Contracts and vendor enforcement deserve a final emphasis because external parties can create ongoing risk even when internal safeguards are strong. Vendors may change features, add subprocessors, shift hosting regions, or update terms in ways that affect privacy. Enforcement requires ongoing oversight, such as reviewing subprocessor notices, validating that purpose limitations are respected, and confirming deletion or return of data at contract end. It also requires ensuring that internal teams do not bypass vendor controls by using unapproved features or sharing extra data. A frequent failure mode is that procurement signs a contract with good clauses, but operations teams configure the service in a way that enables broader data use. Another failure mode is that vendors provide assurance reports, but no one reads them or follows up on exceptions. Effective enforcement treats vendor management as a life cycle, not as a single onboarding event. When external obligations are managed with the same discipline as internal safeguards, the organization becomes more resilient and less dependent on blind trust. As we close, enforcing safeguards through policies, procedures, contracts, and accountability checks is about building a system that keeps privacy protections alive as the organization changes. Policies define the expectations and boundaries that make privacy commitments clear and defensible. Procedures translate those expectations into repeatable actions that people can follow without reinventing decisions each time. Contracts extend safeguards to third parties and create enforceable obligations around use limits, security, incident response, and deletion. Accountability checks verify that safeguards remain implemented, detect drift early, and produce evidence for compliance and improvement. The strongest privacy programs treat these elements as a connected chain, anticipate predictable failure modes like mismatch and exception creep, and design enforcement to fit real work so teams can deliver without bypassing controls. When you can build enforcement this way, privacy becomes dependable rather than fragile, because safeguards do not rely on memory or goodwill alone. They are reinforced by structure, by evidence, and by clear ownership, which is what makes privacy management credible in the long run.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.